The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, you've been all over the Toronto Maple Leafs this week as they continue to process their elimination from the Stanley Cup playoffs. Big story coming out yesterday. Brendan Shanahan, the president of the Leafs, the New York Islanders have been granted permission to talk to him about a vacancy up in their front office. What's the latest on Brendan and the rest of the Leafs? There's so much to get into as we start our show.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a big story in Toronto. Brendan Shanahan, having been the president for 11 years here. I mean, you've all heard the saying by now. The Shana plan was what this kind of project was dubbed when Shanahan came in. The Leafs were in a mess. I know it doesn't feel right now as though everything's orderly, but it was very disorderly when Shanahan was hired back in 2014. He sought about a big restructuring of the front office. They went through the drafting of Nylander, Marner, Matthews, everything else that's happened. And, at this point in time, he doesn't have a contract after the end of June. And so later today on Thursday afternoon, the MLSE board is due to meet. They're doing their end of season review. And so where this goes, it seems like the dominoes are falling in a direction where you want to conclude Shanahan's out and he's going to go to the island. But, I would caution you at least a little bit about drawing that conclusion. I think that's likely where it goes here. But, there's sort of an order of events that are important. And I think fundamentally, if Brendan Shanahan had an opportunity to come back to Toronto, if the ownership, which is meeting again in that board meeting on Thursday afternoon, wanted to bring him back, I think that'd probably be his preference. He's put in a lot of work in the city. For him, it's unfinished business, but it may not be his decision. And so, it's kind of an unusual circumstance, but, that Islanders search has kind of gone on for quite some time. It even involved Ken Holland at one point prior to him going and taking the job in Los Angeles that he did. And so, it does look like Shanahan's probably going to get an opportunity on the island if it's not in Toronto. But at the time of this recording, he hasn't been fired or pushed out or told he's not coming back or anything like that.
Okay, but should he be back?
I suppose it depends who you ask. Look, I think the Leafs, unquestionably, 9 years in the playoffs now. They haven't got beyond the second round during that 9-year run, all under his watch. Anything that you want to pick at from the last 9 years, and certainly in the days since the Leafs were eliminated in Game 7 by the Florida Panthers, I've heard everyone mentioning everything from trading Nazem Kadri back in the day to the contracts given to Nylander and Marner on their second deals coming out of entry level to this move or that move, hiring Kyle Dubas, pushing out Lou Lamoriello, whichever issues you may have with what the Leafs have done. And obviously no team goes perfect with their personnel or roster decisions. That all falls under Shanahan, right? And so if you're looking for someone to, lay blame at, so to speak, or to pay a price for the team's inability to get beyond the second round, it's natural for it to be him. I suppose the one thing I'd say is there's no one else like him with his set of track record out there. I mean, he's got a very unique skill set as a Hall of Fame player, someone who worked 5 years at the head office, in a pretty senior position by the time he left, and then 11 years running a team like the Maple Leafs. I mean, there's a reason the Islanders were anxious to speak with him, right? But, whether or not he should be back, not really my decision to make, but I can understand why they may choose to have a break at this point in time. But I would also say, there's two things going on here. I mean, there's sort of this desire or need, I guess, to determine where things go next, and maybe to almost have a sacrificial kind of, firing essentially, or parting of the ways, from, trying to a breaking point from, okay, this is what's happened to where we're going. But there's a feeling inside the Leafs front office that everything's working pretty well. And I know certainly, from my sources speaking with them, that there's a lot of people that are happy with Brad Treliving and the job he's done in the 2 years he's been GM. Part of that has been him working with Brendan Shanahan. And so I don't think it's as easy, like in the emotions of a loss. I understand why people will sort of demand a change and demand, I've seen what our buddy Steve Dangle's putting out there. He's surprised Brendan Shanahan, even got to drive home from the game without being fired in Game 7. But I think that when you're making big decisions for an organization like the Leafs, they really don't want to be knee jerk or emotional about it. They're not happy at the ownership level. I know that for certain. In fact, I was told they're embarrassed by the way that series ended to Florida. Interestingly enough, Julian, the internal bar for progress, and so I don't mean success. Obviously, the internal bar for success is winning a cup. But I think that had they got to the third round, everyone internally would have said, okay, we're taking steps in the right direction. What's interesting about setting the bar there is they get to game 7 of the second round. And so you're really close on one hand, right? Like you're one win away from getting to sort of the stated like benchmark for, okay, this is moving in the right direction. But you lose that game 6-1. And so I guess you and I could debate, does that matter? Should that matter? It certainly felt like it mattered in real time. It certainly feels like it matters for anyone who's seen the Leafs' inability to win a game 7. I mean, they haven't been blown out in all of them, but it felt kind of familiar in their inability, I guess, to exert themselves in that moment. But you were pretty close on the other hand. And so, that's what's interesting to me is where ownership lands at this board meeting. How do they view that? How do they view being right where they said they kind of wanted to be? But, obviously, seeing the way everything went down Sunday, it was a pretty ugly scene at Scotiabank Arena.
I mean, yes, they were right there, but their last 2 home games, they got embarrassed. It's not like they fought hard and lost game 5, and then they get the game 6 victory, and then game 7 is a hard-fought game where, you know what, man? The Leafs just lost to a better team, which, yes, you can boil down that entire series to that. For me, just looking at this, if I'm in that boardroom, if I have any say in any of this, it's the fact that this team crumbled at home twice near the end of the series when they had opportunities to take advantage, take control, and win that series. Like, for me, I can understand where you're coming from with the front office, and Brad Treliving, I think, made some good moves to try to at least insulate that core, but I can also understand why, if you're looking at the Shanahan plan, you're like, you know what? We need to do something different. If you're looking at that core 4, you're saying, you know what? Something needs to change over there. And I'm not saying you're saying that things won't change, but man, just for me, it's like, okay, you were that close to your bar, but if you look under the hood, there's some issues.
Fair. And really, I'm just trying to lay out the information that they're looking at it with. I don't have a hot take here. Like, I'm not sitting here. I really don't. I could see the argument on both ends. Look, my understanding is it's very, very, very likely that Brendan Shanahan's tenure is ending. And that, like, I think we can even debate at this stage what role a president has with the Leafs. I mean, the organizational structure has changed in that 11 years since Brendan was hired. They brought in Keith Pelley to be the CEO of MLSE last year. If you look at, the way that MLSE's operated with some of their other teams, that, they fired the president of TFC and have a general manager basically who reports right to Pelley, and Pelley reports right to the board, to ownership. There's no reason that kind of structure can't work for a team like the Leafs, even though it's a bigger operation. Obviously, the Leafs have a massive, vast front office. I think, one thing we should expect out of this, and I don't know if it takes days or weeks to all shake out, but, I think there'll be some streamlining internally. With the Leafs, it seems, I've talked to many people around the organization who feel as though there's probably going to be more purging of staff, even lower down the food chain, maybe not necessarily even just, a lot of decisions that make big headlines, but I think that there's kind of a Frankenstein front office that's left over from the Dubas era. Obviously, Brad Treliving naturally has made some hires since he's got there. I think that we're probably going to see a little contraction below even the GM seat. And maybe the way this ends up, I think is most likely is Treliving remains as the GM. He's basically got the keys to the car entering a very important offseason, obviously, for the Leafs. Every offseason is important, but this one's particularly important with Mitch Marner and John Tavares as UFAs, with some big decisions, with maybe a window that's shrinking in terms of a championship window. And so every decision is almost magnified. I think that the most likely structure to emerge from this is just Treliving reporting to Keith Pelley directly, who represents ownership essentially in those kind of things. And so, I don't know if you need a president, I guess is what I'm getting at when you've got someone who's in that CEO role. for most of the time prior to Pelly's hiring, it basically went ownership, Shanahan, Lamoriello or Dubas or Treliving. Like that, and there's almost an extra layer added in there. And so, lots of teams do this lots of different ways, but it's probably time. As I said, I believe Shanahan would love to stay if that option was available to him. But when your bosses are saying, "Hey, go talk to those guys," they want to talk to you, and when your contract's expiring in 38 days or so, give or take, it doesn't look as though that his bosses are inclined to try to keep him around.
And look, for Brendan Shanahan, we all know about his playing career and everything he's done since. I mean, if the New York Islanders, if he has an interest in that job, I don't think he's going to a particularly bad spot. He's going to an organization. He would, if it gets to that point, go to an organization that has the number 1 overall pick in next month's draft. There are worse starting spots.
Yeah, but the Islanders have a big job ahead of them. It actually reminds me a little bit of where the Leafs were at when Shanahan arrived in 2014. Obviously, there's some good players on that roster. You have a Matt Barzal. You have a Noah Dobson. But, contractually, they're in a tough spot. They've got an aging roster. They don't have a lot of draft capital like picks coming that they've been making. They're kind of in no man's land, right? I think, I'm sure Brendan Shanahan, if he moves on, does not want the Shanahan plan like that idea. But I think a new plan is needed there to, I think it's going to be a project for whoever takes over the Islanders. But obviously Shanahan's big name. I think that's what that organization wants. He's got a lot of familiarity in the New York market, obviously played for the Devils and Rangers, worked at the NHL's head office in New York. I think it'd be a big hire for them. The Islanders search has been interesting. Like initially what we were hearing is they just wanted to hire one person, like whatever, a GM, VP, however the titles shake down. I mean, sometimes let's not get hung up on titles as much as, kind of how it would work. And then it seemed like they were more inclined to go with 2 people. We know that they've talked to Marc Bergevin and Matthew Darche as well. They're well down the road with both. I'd heard even there was a world that they wanted to consider trying to bring both of those guys in. Don't think that's going to happen now. Obviously, if they end up hiring Shanahan, I would expect there would be a GM under him. I don't think he would be doing both jobs. I don't know if that's going to be Bergevin or, Darche might make more sense. Obviously Matthew Darche has a lot of experience from his time in Tampa working, beside Julian Brisebois, who may be the best GM in the entire game. And Darche himself is thought of well, but he's had a pretty good on-the-job experience working with one of the best. I've heard Jarmo Kekalainen's name still involved in New York too. So I mean, we'll see where the Islanders end up falling, but it does seem as though they're more inclined now to go with 2 hirings, whether that ends up being president or GM or however they term those things, versus just the one. But man, it's interesting times around the league. There's been a lot of moving parts, and I don't know what it is. It seems like Leafs executives all end up in Long Island because that's where Lou Lamoriello went, of course, when he left Toronto too.
Yeah, it's even still hearing like Marc Bergevin's name. I know he was never a Leaf in his tenure, but like, wow, that's a name I haven't thought about in a while.
Well, you want to know another connection there is when 2 years ago when the GM's job was open in Toronto, Shanahan didn't talk to many candidates, but he did talk to Marc Bergevin as well.
Yes, he did.
About potentially coming to Toronto. Now, obviously, he chose Brad Treliving, but at that time, it was a pretty limited list. The Leafs had identified as people they felt suitable that were available, obviously, in that moment to be hired, and Bergevin was on that short list, and who knows, maybe they'll end up working together there. Or I do know Ken Holland, he's taken over in LA, is more than happy to work with Bergevin if Bergevin stays with the Kings. So Mark's at a good spot in that lots of people want him. And it's more about, I guess, just finding the right fit for everyone involved.
Any other takeaways from what that meeting could be like on Thursday or any of the exit interviews from the Leafs this week?
Well, I think that maybe the one takeaway too is the MLSE is going to go through an ownership transfer. At this point in time, it's still Bell and Rogers owning 37.5% each, with Larry Tannenbaum having most of the rest of the stake. At a certain point here in the very near future, the sale of Bell's stake of 37.5 will go to Rogers. So then Rogers will control 75% of that company. It's kind of an interesting backdrop. Like, how does that work at the board level? Because the way it works right now, Julian, is Rogers has 3 seats on the board, Bell has 3 seats on the board, and Larry Tannenbaum has 2 with Dale Laxman. And so obviously there has to be consensus for major decisions with that kind of structure, or 2 sides kind of have to link up together to overrule the other. But in the near future, I believe Rogers will end up with 6 seats on that board, in which case, obviously, Rogers can pretty much unilaterally make decisions on anything from hiring or firing a president to major other decisions for any of the teams, the Leafs, the Raptors, what have you. So, because that sale hasn't gone through yet, Rogers doesn't control those seats. So, the problem with this is I don't know. I can't tell you how that's going to play out. It's an important piece of information to understand, though. I mean, when it comes to Shanahan, there could be varying views at ownership level, right? There might be some people or one of those companies that thinks he's got to go, but there might be another that's saying, and I do believe there's some thought that he should stay. So I don't know how basically how that will fall in the meeting. And then obviously, we're going to have a change at the board level in the near future. So merely to say that this is, unfortunately, we don't get into those board meetings. There's no cameras present, but I'd love to be a fly on the wall just to see how they go. And, this is going to impact the future of the Raptors too. I think that there could be changes on that side of things, which I realize we're a hockey podcast, but this is a major sporting brand. It's bigger than the Leafs. It's one of the biggest sporting entities in the world, and it's going to go through a pretty big transition here. And so the Shanahan news, while it's big in Leaf circles, is part of a larger change that's going on at the same time.
Yeah, and you've been providing great coverage on that story as it's been developing. If that's it on Leaf stuff, we did kind of touch off on when you mentioned Marc Bergevin, potentially whatever interest the Islanders may have in him. Any other news and notes with regards to any other vacancies, whether with coaching or with management vacancies across the league?
I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, it looks like Chicago is very close, if not imminently, about to announce Jeff Blashill as their head coach. Sounds like Anders Sorensen, who was the interim coach after Luke Richardson was fired in season, will remain on that staff as an assistant or associate. However, that all shakes out. That would leave essentially 3 open spots as of now. Seattle's still looking for its head coach, Boston and Pittsburgh. The Seattle job, that they've requested permission here since the Leaf season ended to speak to Lane Lambert, who was the Leafs assistant in charge of kind of their defensive play the last couple of years. You'll recall he was the New York Islanders coach, head coach for a time. He's worked with Barry Trotz a lot over the seasons, both in Nashville and Washington prior to his time there. So very experienced guy. And I think specifically when it comes to defensive play, has a pretty good track record of getting teams, doing the things they need to do on that side of the puck. The Kraken have also, been pretty interested in Mitch Love. I know we mentioned his name a couple weeks ago. He's sort of we'll call him a younger up and comer in the coaching world. Has been with Washington the last couple seasons on Spencer Carberry's staff, and he's in the mix both in Pittsburgh and Seattle. So we'll see how that goes. And it's funny, like how much there ends up being that cross-pollination. One interesting note on the Pittsburgh search is that Kyle Dubas is currently in Sweden, where he's the GM of Team Canada at the World Hockey Championship. So he's been doing interviews, the preliminary set of interviews on Zoom from Sweden. That tournament ends this weekend, and he'll be back in Pittsburgh early next week. And so, I would expect the sort of final interviews to come in person back in Pittsburgh, once Kyle's back from Europe. But, they've had to do their search a little bit differently. On the Boston front, one name I've heard pretty consistently there is Marco Sturm. Obviously former Bruins player at one point in time, but someone who's, been pretty accomplished in the AHL. And the feeling around Marco has long been that it's a matter of when, not if, he becomes an NHL head coach. Not saying that he's 100% getting the job there, but, I know that he's been among the people they've been interested in. So there's still some moving parts in the coaching searches, but I think that they're going to come to a close here probably by early June. I would think all the coaching vacancies will be filled, at least the head coaching vacancies. And the Islanders seem like they're pretty close. I mean, I think this week they'd like to get something done. So if it's Shanahan, I imagine that'll happen relatively quickly. If it's not, I think that they can pivot back and figure out how it works with the people they've already had multiple sets of interviews with, both on Zoom and in person. So, that's kind of my sense of where things stand on the personnel front. And we're almost getting to a point in season, I think, where some player movement's going to start again soon too. I mean, you almost have to get through this wave of what are the franchises going to look like? What's each organization going to go forward with? And then you start getting down to the player decisions, trades, obviously free agencies on the horizon and all those things. So, we're not quite there yet, but it isn't too far off for those that are, we're still watching the games every night, of course, but there's 28 teams not playing right now and are well in the down the road and trying to start their planning for 25, 26.
So you're telling me it's premature to start thinking about offer sheet season? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I mean, it's never premature, but it's not. I mean, you can't sign an offer sheet until anyone's officially restricted free agent on July 1st. I do know there are teams out there that are thinking about those things, that are looking at the players. I know one guy that's obviously had a lot of talk about him is Matthew Knies. I think notably, what he told the media at his breakdown day with the Maple Leafs is that he's only focused on being in Toronto. That's consistent with the messaging I've heard on this file all season long. I don't think that was just words to get through an interview. I do believe, while there's been a lot of public focus on him potentially getting an offer sheet, I mean, I don't see it really happening or making sense. I don't see the Leafs being backed into a financial corner, especially because we're expecting Mitch Marner to leave as a free agent. Toronto's going to have all kinds of cap space, in the unlikely event he ever signed one, that being Knies. I just think they would have the cap room to match that offer if it was a fair offer. And if they think it's an offer that's a goofy amount of money, well, then they can just take the multiple first round picks, because I think anything $8 million and under, it's probably in the comfort level for the Leafs. I don't have the exact breakdown in front of me, but if you're signing him to a $9 or $10 million offer sheet, you're talking about more than one first rounder coming Toronto's way. And so I don't think he's a player. It's more, it might not end up being the summer of the offer sheet as much as it's been billed, because every team has cap space. What made the Edmonton-St. Louis situation unique is just that St. Louis wanted to do it. They obviously had two players they could target, so put the Oilers in a tough spot where they probably were never going to be able to match both. They could have maybe matched one, and obviously they ended up letting both players walk. But Edmonton was backed into a pretty big corner there in terms of the available cap space. I don't think you're going to see quite as much of that. I mean, maybe a team like Dallas is in that position because they've already signed Mikko Rantanen to that big extension. They have some other contracts kicking in to Wyatt Johnston and the like. So, the Stars are one of the teams that are pretty highly committed. But I mean, at a $95.5 million cap, most teams do have the room, I think, to protect the players they want. And the other part of it, players have to want to sign them. And that was why I highlighted Knies' comments there too, is I just don't get the sense he wants to move on. I mean, there's a difference, the Broberg situation, for example, like Edmonton drafted him, he's back and forth. I think there was some frustration in his case just about how he was handled by the organization. Contrast that with Matthew Knies. He was a second-round pick by Toronto. They signed him out of the University of Minnesota, put him immediately in their lineup. He played in the playoffs right away. That was 2 years ago. He's spent most of certainly this last season playing on the top line with Matthews and Marner, having great opportunities. Whenever they've had an injury, he's the next guy up on power play one. His production's increasing. I mean, he's getting all the runway he could want. He's on a team that's won a lot of games. So, it doesn't necessarily line up that he would be all that anxious to go sign with maybe one of the weaker teams in the league, just because he's had life pretty good with the Leafs so far.
You mentioned the Dallas Stars. I remember when I was looking at their cap projection on Puckpedia a couple of weeks ago. I think they're supposed to have a pretty limited amount of cap space entering the free agent market, with a handful of UFAs even at their disposal too. I wondered if like a guy like Maverick Bourque, who's like a pretty good prospect for them, who's played some NHL games, of course, would be like a prime RFA candidate. I'm just spitballing out loud here, but when you have like about $8 million in cap space coming, and guys like Michael Granlund are going to be UFAs too. Jamie Benn is up there as well. Like, I'm very curious about Dallas's situation entering this offseason.
Yeah, I think that he could be a candidate for sure, because that's the sort of guy I think you have to look at, generally speaking. it's going to be a player that isn't a frontline player yet, that maybe another teams thinks is in a position to pop or to take a step. And you could conceivably construct an offer sheet that might make it hard for the Stars to match. I mean, look, they just played game one of the Western Conference Final last night. Maverick Bourque was out of their lineup. So he's not currently in their top 12 forwards. So if he's getting a pretty sizable raise on his next deal, there just might be a situation that they love the player. They have to let him walk. I mean, that could be, that's the sort of guy that I look for. It's not always just the biggest name having the best season. That can get those sort of offer sheets, but we'll see. I mean, look, there's might be an evolution here. This could be the crazy summer. I mean, there's definitely mixed opinions out there. I've heard Joel Hofer's name mentioned, the goaltender in St. Louis, as a possible offer sheet candidate. Obviously, St. Louis was on the other side of two. I mean, look, I'm certainly not going to sit here and say there'll be none, but I think that it might not be like this explosion of them either. The one thing the St. Louis one might have done, though, is, first of all, it worked out from the Blues end of things. Those players played well for St. Louis. I don't think they looked grossly overpaid. The Blues only give up some draft picks for them, and they get the players while they're young, right? Like you're not getting 28-year-olds, you're getting 22-year-olds. So you're getting them for their prime years, presumably. I think that helps make it maybe a little more enticing. Plus, maybe any stigma that's attached to it is just like a little bit removed, right? I mean, I've talked about this a lot with my sources around the league. Like, some people say the stigma aspect is overblown, that they just have felt like it's not proven to be a good way to get players. But I have to believe there's a little bit of this will help normalize it, so to speak. I think there'll be less people going, "Oh my God, can you believe it?" if it happens again, in July or August this year, versus what you saw last August when the Blues did it to the two Oilers players. So, I think it's good for the league if there's a little more chaos. And this offseason certainly is different than many that came before it, because we've had such a flat salary cap. And I think the teams are going to have to get creative in how they look to improve, because there's just not enough good players to go around on July 1st to fit all the needs and desires of teams out there for areas that they're looking to find an upgrade.
Yeah. If I'm Craig Conroy in Calgary and I have about $28 million in cap space, someone's got to get an offer sheet. I almost thought they should have done it last year with Dylan Holloway and their situation. That would have added a lot of spice to that Battle of Alberta. But that's one team I'm going to keep my eye on. I mean, it helps that I've covered the team before, but I'm definitely going to keep my eye on them for that type of offer sheet season as it develops.
Sure, and look, they're a team that got pretty close to making the playoffs this year, where people didn't expect it. The new building's coming. I know that's a big part of it. Look, I could see Calgary getting aggressive in free agency as well. Trying to lure a big name that way. And now they have that building to sell a little bit, right? Like, I think that the promise of top tier facilities, we shouldn't overlook that or underestimate that, I guess is a better way to put it, that could matter to players. Sometimes it's more than just the money in the contract. It's sort of lifestyle and, what's going to be afforded to you. And the Flames are looking to make a big upgrade here in the next year or two with that new building set to open.
Oh, for sure. Talk to McKenzie Weegar about how important facilities are with the team on that front. One other team, if I can just continue on just going around the league here, what do you think about what's going on in Buffalo? I know there's some reports maybe that Bowen Byram, his name is out there on the market. What are you hearing on him?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Sabres have to sign him. He's a restricted free agent. They've got a lot of money tied up in their blue line already. I think it only makes sense to listen to offers and to see if there's something that makes sense. The quest in Buffalo is, it remains unchanged in a sense. They have to find a way to take that step forward. And, Byram does a lot of great things on the ice. He's a smaller player as a defender. Obviously has some good offensive instincts, and maybe they're already covered in those areas, if you know what I'm saying. But I do. That being said, I think he would have some value out there. Sort of like the move they made at the deadline with Dylan Cousins. I think they've gotten to a point you can't just be signing all your guys to 7 and 8 year deals that aren't getting you over the hump. And so it does seem as though he's a name that is worth keeping an eye on just because there's an action item there. I mean, if they're not trading him, probably looking at trading someone else from the blue line, right? And so, it's just going to be, there'd be too much money tied up in that one position for them. And, frankly, it hasn't been enough of a position of strength given the individuals they have on that blue line already between Dahlin, Owen Power, Samuelson, down the list. So, I think that there's good reason for that scuttlebutt. And as I say, I don't think the trade talk has really picked up yet, but we're on the verge of being on the verge of it all getting a little crazy. I think once we get into June, once we get to the Stanley Cup final, that timeline, you get to 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks to the draft, that tends to be the window where obviously teams start, they're going to get their buyouts soon. They have to make decisions on restricted free agent qualifying offers. And I think a little bit more of the player movement stuff kicks in with, we currently have a team without a GM right now. So there's still a few places where you can't even really have those conversations, but that's going to change in the short term.
Fascinating times in Buffalo. Thinking of guys like JJ Peterka, who are going to be, or who are also RFAs as well and will be due for new contracts too. Fascinating times out in Buffalo. Can't wait to see what comes out of that. I'd like one big thought on the conference finals series as they are. We should start with the most recent one that just played, Dallas and Edmonton. What a game to start off that series. Edmonton taking a 3-1 lead and then Dallas turning it on to win it. What are your thoughts on that series?
I was struck by the pace that game one was played at. Like it was like cyborg hockey. It was crazy how fast that game was. Obviously, Edmonton fumbled away a 2-goal lead, which is not something you expect to see them do. Taking all that string of penalties obviously didn't help. I mean, mixing in a penalty kill is allowed too, though. I that just feels like it's going to be a bit of a heavyweight series for me, one that goes pretty long. But look, the Stars took care of business there, and give them credit. I mean, you always look for those games that something happens you don't really expect. And you're like, man, they might regret that one. Like if it gets to game 7 and the Oilers lose the series, they might literally look back at game 1. I mean, that's sort of what happened in that Toronto-Florida series. They had a lead in game 3, the Leafs did, and lost it and losing overtime. And you just think like, man, they win that game, maybe it doesn't get to the point where they're eliminated. So, I mean, obviously the Oilers themselves can't be thinking of that. But look, this is a heavyweight matchup, right? You've got the Stars in the conference final for the 3rd straight year. The Oilers here for the 3rd time in 4 years. Obviously, Edmonton got through last year. One of the reasons the Oilers beat Dallas last year is because of their penalty kill. They didn't give up much to the Stars. So the fact the Stars cashed a few power play goals in game 1 already flips the narrative from where it's been. And also, one thing Dallas has not gotten in this playoffs really is the kind of depth scoring you would want. But who scores in that game? You get Seguin scoring. You get Duchesne with a big goal. Some of the guys that haven't been contributing as much offensively because it had been the Mikko Rantanen show by and large, bringing them through 2 tough series against Colorado and Winnipeg, they get on the board. And so that's a little ominous if you're on the Oilers side of the equation. But look, Edmonton's power play has to get going. That's been a historical strength of theirs. And, you could just see McDavid and Draisaitl. Like, I love the shots at the end of the game. I don't know if you saw, Julian, where they're on the bench.
Yeah.
And they just seeing red. Like, these guys, everybody wants to win. Every single player in the league wants to win. Everyone still playing wants to win. But it almost feels like Draisaitl and McDavid want to win even more. So, that might not be entirely fair. But it just seems like, my goodness, they're so driven to get the job done. So I'm interested to see what they can push back with in game 2.
I know we've seen the video in the Amazon Face-Off series where Connor McDavid's like yelling at everybody. It's not good enough. We remember that from the Stanley Cup final last year. I wonder what Leon Draisaitl is like when he's yelling at his teammates.
I mean, I love it. Leon just calls it like it is. I mean, even in his post-game remarks, I read in Daniel Nugent-Bowman's story, he said something like, you got to get a kill. He's like, I'm not on that, so I can't speak to it. But I mean, it's sort of obvious. Like, you have to get a penalty kill. Like, he's very intense and he's very plainly spoken. Like, he doesn't mince words. So, I'm not saying that it's all yelling and screaming every time the Oilers go back to the dressing room trailing by a goal in a big game, but certainly I think that there's a high level of internal accountability. This is what you get to when you have a great team. Like, I don't think that's any different than what you're seeing in Florida. Like, I think that those guys that have been through so many big games together, I don't think Paul Maurice has to do a lot of the policing behind the scenes. I really believe that's a group that calls themselves out, whether that's a Barkov or a Bennett or a Kachuk or even now Brad Marchand. Like, that he's not easing into a dressing room. He's seen so much. I just think that the best teams do finally get to a spot where they are internally holding themselves accountable and making sure they're up to a certain level. And the Oilers were for 2 periods, and then they weren't. And so I would expect a much better game from them. And I think a lot of that conversation isn't Chris Knobloch coming in and knocking over sticks and yelling and screaming. I think it's probably the top players on the team that are giving the most on the ice too. And that's the other key part of this is accountability has to be not just words, but the actions.
Tell you what, this series is not ending in a sweep. I don't care what producer Drew thinks.
Yeah, he's been saying that. He said that, to be fair, since before game 1. But I'm with you. I don't see a sweep happening really on either ledger, but especially in the Western Final. I just don't think that's how it's going to go.
Give me one thought on the Eastern Final between Carolina and Florida.
It's really more of a thought for all 4 remaining teams. I wonder if anyone can stop Florida. The Panthers are really humming right now. And you look at the way they've won, the games they've won, like they're taking it to it. Like the games that Florida lost in the Toronto series were close games. The games that they won were runaways, right? What was game 1 against Carolina? And I know, there's aspects of the games the Hurricanes liked and the Panthers didn't like everything, but, the Panthers are overwhelmingly dialed in right now. And so I guess, maybe the counter argument is it's hard to stay at that level for a whole month, and that's what it would take to win another cup. But, they know the recipe. When they're playing their game, it is just suffocating. It feels like they can really grind things down on their opponents. And so I'm very curious as we get to Thursday night's game, just to see what Carolina, what sort of adjustments they can make and what they can find to counteract that, because losing 2 in a row at home to start a series would seem like a death sentence, a death knell. And so the Hurricane season in some ways is on the line. Maybe not officially. I get that obviously they still have some room to play with in this game too. But Florida to me is just getting better and better and better and looking more like a team that knows how to get the job done and is gonna find a way to do it. Man,
just Carolina, man, like it feels like it's happened often enough. They get themselves to this spot and they deserve more respect. But I'm not saying they're going to get steamrolled by Florida here, but like I haven't seen too many people give them much of a chance against this Panthers team, basically for the reasons that you've listed with how the Panthers have been playing.
Well, some of that is like, I'll admit my own bias. I feel like Carolina had an easier path through the first 2 rounds. So like they push away the Devils pretty easily, better Washington team, but they knocked them out in 5. So I feel like it's almost like I haven't seen enough Carolina games. I haven't seen them pushed or tested enough in the playoffs to know what they're going to do. That test now has just arrived, right? Like I think the way game 1 goes down. And so that's where I'm saying, what do they bring back with in game 2? I mean, maybe they come out punching, and I don't mean literally, but with the way they play, and then we're having a different conversation by Monday's show. I mean, I'm not counting the Hurricanes out. I just think I've seen a little more from Florida to believe that they're going to be able to be at this level, and I just don't yet know if the Hurricanes can get there. Now, I've seen all the stats going around. Like some people are including them getting swept in the conference final in like 2009 or whatever. Like, I mean, look, if you're a fan of the Hurricanes, that's a relevant stat. If you're looking at this specific series, that bears no resemblance to anything that matters. I mean, Eric Stahl was in a box in game 1 waving a towel, in 2009. He was playing for the Hurricanes. I mean, it's a different thing, but I think that there is a psychological hurdle here for, I guess, the Sebastian Ahos and Slavins and the top players that have been in Carolina to push a little farther. I think they're a better team than they've been in the past. Even with some of the losses, even not having Natchez, for example, Svechnikov was hurt a couple years ago when they got this far. So I think that there's no reason for me to sit here and think they're going to get swept, but can they beat Florida 4 out of 6 now? That's that's still an open question, and we got to see a little bit more on the ice before we have our answer.
13 straight losses in the Eastern Conference Final, though. I get it, different teams, but that's quite a losing streak.
Yeah, it's a lot. And look, if it ends in game 2 and it's 1-1 and Carolina wins 4-1, then we got ourselves a series. I mean, I don't think the Panthers, they never plan on a sweep. Like, all the talk on the Panthers is always just pound their D, be ready to wear them out over 7 games. Like, they plan on playing long series. I don't think anyone should be making plans in Carolina or in Florida for late next week, because this is going to be over quickly. I think the Hurricanes are going to put that to rest at some point, but I still don't know yet if I'm comfortable thinking that they can push the Panthers right out of the playoffs. Florida's, I mean, look, they're trying to reach a 3rd straight final. Obviously, they're doing something right down there, and they just appear to me to be finding a level of execution that is hard to match right now.
All right. As we are recording right now, we're on the eve of the quarterfinal day of the World Hockey Championships. How have you been enjoying that tournament?
I mean, it's been great what I've been able to watch. I have an affinity for the tournament. I know it doesn't get most of our listenership is probably based in North America and doesn't get the ton of attention over here, but it's been a fun event, and the quarterfinal day is always the most nervous day, because you can have a great tournament, and if you lose that one game, you're going home just like that. At least once you get through a quarterfinal, get to a semifinal, you're guaranteed to play for a medal. But Canada's been the class of the event. They did lose a game in a shootout to Finland, where UC Saros was the star. But Sweden's had a strong team playing on home ice. They've just added William Nylander, who I should note didn't speak to the media before the quarterfinal game, which caused a real big stir for all the media there, and because they're at home in Stockholm, and he's a big star for their team. He's performed at a high level at every Worlds he comes to. He's played at a lot of them. Obviously, helped them win a gold medal, kind of in famous fashion, and jumped into Henrik Lundqvist's arms and knocked him over years ago. It's been fun and pretty cool to see Sidney Crosby playing with a guy like Macklin Celebrini too. It really feels like Celebrini has put himself on the radar for consideration for the Olympic team for Canada in Milan in 2026. It's a big hill to climb for any player, especially any young player. But Canada will be able to bring 14 forwards to that tournament. I don't think it's crazy to think they might go with a younger one or two, even than what we saw at the Four Nations event. And so Celebrini's definitely in the mix. I mean, he's got the smarts to play with something like Crosby, which is really saying something. They've been a hit, and whether or not he makes the Olympics now or not, I just think the chance to spend that time playing with Crosby is pretty special for a guy like him, or Adam Fantilli, some of the other young players on the team. And so, we got a pretty good run to the medals here in store here the next few days.
Man, I know I was on the train a couple of months ago. I was actually having a conversation about it with fellow Ottawa colleague Alex Adams. And he had mentioned, like Macklin Celebrini is probably that good to get consideration for the Canadian team in 2026. And at the time I was like, I'm not sure. And then just getting to see him play up front, like you're like, okay, like he definitely has the potential to be considered. And then now seeing him line up with Sid, and I know he's still very formal with him. I've seen some of those quotes go around. Mr. Crosby. Like I've been swayed a bit. I like his chances for 2026 now. Like I thought Nick Suzuki would kind of be in that spot that I'd be thinking where Macklin Celebrini is, but like Celebrini's shown so much in his rookie year, and now he's getting that opportunity to display that talent at the Worlds, and not just in a extra forward position. He gets to play with the best players. Like I love his chances for next February.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of it will hinge on the start to the season too. As much as we're in the moment, like I was sort of, knocking on everyone get ahead of themselves in the U.S. goalie conversation based on one playoff series. I think that what players do between now and the start of that Olympic tournament will matter. Obviously, what they do in terms of being selected between now and December matters. And look, a lot of people have banged on Connor Bedard for not going to the Worlds. I don't think he's out of the mix entirely either. I mean, there's a school of thought out there that Bedard is, as much as obviously Hockey Canada would have wanted him to be at the Worlds again, that it might be better for him to spend this time in the gym and doing the things he needs to do rather than playing games. That, he needs to get faster in order to be an impact player at the NHL level, and that this is a huge summer of training for him. And obviously when you go to the Worlds, it's 2 weeks after your regular season before it even starts. It goes on for 3 weeks to a month. That does take a meaningful amount of time, especially for someone as young as Bedard, out of the formal training window. You're staying in shape over there, but you're not necessarily building on the base that you have. And so, I think that we should keep in mind that both of these guys are probably going to be important parts of Team Canada's way down the line. And while we don't get to see Bedard playing in this tournament, so he's not making his way through your Twitter feed or whatever with the gifts, it's not as though he's totally out of mind here. I think that the start to next season is really what matters for anyone who's on the bubble of the Olympic selection. I'll go out on a limb and say McKinnon, Crosby, McDavid, they're probably fine for Canada, though. Makar, all the abs.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about those guys. All right, cool. Is there a stick tap you'd like to deliver before we get out of here? That being said, I still think what you really said about Mark Scheifele earlier this week was really well done, and I invite people who somehow haven't listened to our last episode to check out the end of that, where Chris delivered a really good stick tap for Mark Scheifele. Obviously played through some tragedy at the end of the Jets Stars series. So if you want to let that be your stick tap for the week, that is totally fine. And I could come up with mine.
No, I'll go in a different direction today. I'm going to stick tap with anticipation some great news for the hockey world.
Okay.
And that is my understanding that the CBA extension with the NHL and the NHLPA is very, very, very near to being completed, which I think is tremendous news for anyone who works in the industry in any capacity. Now, just how close it is the subject of some debate. I had one source tell me this week it's any day now. I had someone else push back against that, say bad scoop. But, the sense I am getting overarching over all that is that they are very near to wrapping it up to NHL and the Players Association. And so, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but there was no other natural way to get that little piece of info in there than maybe right here, than to say that, it does sound as though we're on the precipice here of an extension to the CBA agreement, which means no lockout, which means no uncertainty for the business, which means continuity. And anyone who lived through 2004, 05 or 12, 13, we don't need to revisit all that. But, it was only the pandemic actually that came along in 2020 that got a pretty quick extension done at that point in time, because the players and the owners had to work together on getting through that, the many challenges around that. It seems as though the working relationship has never been better, and I would expect some sort of formal announcement here in the pretty near future.
Have we ever used stick taps to break news before? I think this is a first.
Might be a first. I don't know for breaking news, but certainly we're advancing the story. It's getting close.
I mean, that's still pretty good. I like that as a stick tap. I'll just keep mine basic. Shea Gilgeous-Alexander winning MVP, first Canadian since Steve Nash to do it. I like that for him. I think that's pretty obvious. So I like that for SGA. The Thunder seem like they're going to be doing pretty well in the Western Conference Final. They got the Game 1 win over Minnesota. I like it for SGA. Yeah,
I saw that. The MVP's from the 905. So they're out the 905.
Got to respect the 905, and got to respect the Chris Johnston show as well. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, and get your questions in for the next Ask CJ. I know we kind of didn't really do it, but I think we all I think the questions that came in for this week's Ask CJ, they were all Leafs related. We tackled all those questions anyway. We'll get back to a proper mailbag next week.
Sure, and anything that's left over that was more evergreen that we didn't address, feel free to include those on Monday, pal.
Absolutely. All right, we'll talk to you all next week.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.